G'day, it's Professor Joseph Drew here, and I'm here this time to talk to you about how to plan an academic paper. Now, I must confess this video, I originally made it with my postgraduate, my PhD students, and my master's students in mind. However, I do feel that a lot of people might benefit from giving a little bit more thought to how they approach the exercise of writing a scholarly paper. Now, what are the advantages of planning? I do realize most people do some planning, but the degree of planning I'm talking about is a week's worth of work. It's not an hour or two thinking about what you're going to write. So why would you want to go to these extraordinary lengths to plan an academic piece of writing? Well, first of all, one of the criticisms you get a lot as an academic is that the paper doesn't seem to flow, or it's not a coherent whole. Planning makes sure that it does flow and it does have a coherent whole. And you'll see in my planning strategy how I deliberately build in segues to get myself from one section to another. Second, planning is just much more efficient. When I started changing to a more intensive form of planning about 4 years ago, not only did I start hitting the better journals consistently and the overseas journals, which is really difficult to do when you're writing about Australian local government, but I found that it took me way less time to actually write the paper. You can either spend a few hours planning and then spend 3 or 4 weeks struggling to write the paper and make it all make sense, or you can spend a week planning and then spend only a week actually doing the write-up because you've already thought through everything that you need to go through. And as I've already intimated, much better outcomes. If you see my work, particularly in the last 5 years, you'll see that it's improved dramatically. You'll see that I'm getting in the top journals overseas, which is the holy grail for Australian academics. And I feel my work is much better. I'm much prouder of it. And at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is whether I like my work, whether I'm proud of my work, and whether there's a legacy that I'm leaving behind because it's worthwhile and other people can access it. So early on, before you do the intensive planning, you need to answer these sorts of questions. So what is your research question? What is your question that you're going to go and examine in this paper? Now, I hate the explicit spelling out of a research question in a paper. I think that looks amateurish. It's what you see in the lower ranked journals a lot and in some students' work. You can state your academic question without saying my academic research question is such and such. And when you know your question really well, it makes everything else easier and better. Now, it's remarkable how many times people haven't fully thought out what their question is before they start a piece of work. And I'm guilty of all these sins in the early part of my career. Please don't think that I'm having a go at everyone else. Next step is, what theory are you going to use? You must have a strong theory. I don't care how empirically sophisticated your work is. To be a good piece of academic work, you must have a strong academic theory, which you're either going to build on, or you're going to challenge, or my favorite thing is to put a great big twist on an established old theory. You've got to have that. So as soon as you know what you're actually doing, start casting around for a theory that you can use to nest all of your work in. Then get your hands on every piece of work you can around that theory and really understand it before you go any further. Who are the key writers in the area? You know, in every field there's some top dog who's known as being the person that controls that field. You need to find that out for your field. You need to get some of their recent work. You need to have a look at the reference list of their work and see who they're citing, who they approve of, because that's who you need to be reading and citing too. Academic work is a bit club-like. The big dogs control the game. They invariably are the ones reviewing your work, particularly at the high-ranked journals. You can buck the system if you like. I often buck the system, but I tend to do so with academics who have long passed away. But you're going to struggle to get published if you want to buck the club system. It's much better off playing the game like we all do. Where is your evidence? Where are you going to find it? Have you looked into alternate sources of evidence? Have you looked into different sources of evidence that you could link to some sort of database you found? Have you actually gone and got the evidence yourself? Well, one of the big reasons I had a very quick start in this field was I was prepared to print up all the financial statements of all the local governments and actually type in the different elements of revenue and expenditure and create my own database. Most economists are looking for a ready-made database, and they make do with a ready-made database. If you're prepared to put in the work, building your own database is always going to be much more successful. I have that finance data direct from the financial reports. I then augment it with data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, used to be called the National Regional Profile, and I also augment it with more data that comes from the local government grants commissions. So 3 sources of data to build a database. The majority of academics want to use an existing database. Often it's not made for your purpose. Whomever established a database had a particular purpose, and that may not be what you need to do a good piece of research. Now, I understand creating your database is extremely time consuming. I've done it for many, many years. I've got 10 years of this for every state in Australia, but I can't see an alternative myself. What is the most suitable empirical technique for this? Often I've had to go and learn a brand new empirical technique, and that can take weeks. Think it through. If you don't have the skills, but you know of a colleague or another student that does, how about you tap them on the shoulder and ask them if they want to be a co-author, or ask them for help. That might be quicker than trying to get on top of this stuff yourself. And the last thing is, what's the point? So what? You're writing a paper. So what? What's the point? What do you want the reader to walk away with? Now, for me, it's almost always, I want some sort of practical public policy intervention or recommendation that can come out of my work. But if you're in another field, there might be another reason. You might want to challenge an existing way of thinking or open up a new way of thinking. But you've got to know what this overarching point is. Why on earth are you writing this paper? What do you want to achieve? And until you can answer these questions, I'm afraid you're just not ready to start the planning process. So this is a look at the basic plan I start with. So I start with a mind map sort of thing. So here's the title, and this is a paper that got published in an A-ranked journal on its first outing with only minor revisions, so it worked. I started with the title of the paper. I then split it up into sections. Typically a paper will have 5 or 6 sections. So there's an introduction, there's a theory section that usually comes in second, and I'm using the established theory and extending on it there. There's the empirical strategy. When you're doing heavy duty econometrics, you've got to lay out how you're doing this. There's a results and discussion section next, and then there's a conclusion. Now, for each section, I've then put in little marks you can see coming off. And each one of them is a paragraph or a few paragraphs, okay, about the sorts of things I want to do. Now, I imagine you can't read my scroll, and it's not important to read my scroll at this stage. The idea is to realize that you start with your main idea, you then split it into sections, and then each section you split into 4 or 5 sections. That's the first stage of a plan, but you don't just leave it there. 2 days later, because I start all my files with a date, and I recommend that you do. It's great advice that Michael Court, my supervisor when I did my PhD, told me, and I'm so glad he did, because it makes it easy to find things and understand what you did later on down the track when you're looking at it. A few days later, I went and redid this plan, and you can see there's the same 5 sections, but now there's far more detail in each section. I really fleshed that out. So essentially there's a point for every paragraph, and some of these paragraphs are split up into a point for every sentence. You also see this new stuff here, this pink stuff here. This is what I refer to as my segue. How am I going to get from that section to that section? I'm going to have to try to link those two ideas together. I need to think of something that gets me from one place to another. And you can see I've done that for each section. Much more thorough. These segues are quite prominent. So it's a much more developed plan. And that's taken me 2 days to get from this first one that you saw a few minutes ago to this plan that's in front of you. But I don't stop there. Before I write each section, I do another plan, which is what I'm about to show you. So here's my plan for the theory section. And you can see now that the theory section, section 2, is now broke up into 4 main things I want to address. Now, I was using Hirschman's theory of expert voice and loyalty, and I was putting a little bit of a twist on it. So voice is one section I want to talk about. Exit's another thing I want to talk about. Barriers to exit is another thing I want to talk about. And because this paper was about selective skills, I had to look at types of exit, internal exit. So you can now see that I've got those 4 sections, but each section is then broken up again. And at this stage, I definitely have a dot point for each paragraph. And in fact, most sentences have a dot point. See these dotty lines here? This is how I'm going to segue from this section to this section. And you can see more segues here. And you can see where I've linked points together. That means they all have to appear in the same paragraph. The critical thing you're trying to do here with your planning is link like ideas together. So link like ideas together in the same paragraphs, and link like paragraphs together in the same section or subsection. Sounds so simple, but for one who's done an awful lot of reviewing and written an awful lot of papers, it's something that people really struggle with. And I think the reason is because they don't sit down and do this planning work. As I said, this plan took well over a week, but the actual writing, I was writing a section a day easily and having time left over to do all the admin stuff that I spend most of my life doing. So it's efficient. It seems like you're spending a lot of time, and you are up front, but you're saving the time at the end through the writing. Now, I've had very experienced colleagues that I've worked with over many years who've had much simpler planning processes. The great Brian Dollery just has a title for each subsection and a couple of dot points. Another great colleague of mine, Michael Court, tends to have a general outline but makes it up as he goes. This is my process. It works for me. I know from teaching master's level students for many years, when I make them do this plan, I make them have a one-on-one Skype session with me where they sit through and explain their plan. I know that their work improves, and they tell me that their work improves. It's worth the trouble. It's going to take you time until you get good at this planning. Now, I've done this 75 times now, but you will get good at it, and you'll get better over time, and you'll see an improvement in your work. I can't overemphasize. It takes time, it takes discipline to stop and plan rather than get stuck in and write about this thing that you're so excited about. But the payoffs are immense. It's well worth the trouble. So in conclusion, it works. You can see my scholarly record. You can see for yourself it works. It takes time to get good at this. And please note that each one of those plans I showed you were the final copy. Prior to that, there's plans done in lead pencil, and I'm erasing things and moving them from one position up to another, so I'm linking all the like ideas together so the ideas flow with nice little segues. There's probably a dozen sheets of paper before I got to each one of those penned, pretty neat plans. Now, if you're one of my students, the standard of planning I'm wanting to see minimum is that initial plan, the first plan I put up there. If you're a PhD student of mine, I want to see it planned all the way through to then before you touch a piece of paper with a pen. Much worthwhile. I feel very blessed that I stumbled across this way. Give it a shot. Don't just try it once. Try it a few times so that you can get better at it, and go back and see what the outcomes are. I'm pretty certain you're going to find that you're much happier with the final product. And as I say, at the end of the day, that's the important thing. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.